when you get close to God and you have a stiff neck. He might just destroy you. So God says, fine. I'm not going to destroy you, but I'm not going to get near you either. And in fact, this is kind of an act of mercy. He says, I'm not going to be near you guys because I might just obliterate you. I might just destroy you. So you guys go into the promised land, and I'm going to be over here on the side, far enough away so that you don't get singed. And Moses is like, no, God. There's got to be a better way. And so he negotiates with God again, and he comes up with a compromise. Chapter 33, verse 15. You guys read this story before? It's fascinating. You got to read these stories of the Bible. They're crazy, the stuff that goes on. Verse 15. Then Moses says to God, says, if your presence does not go with us, do not even send us up from here. So what's the point of us going there when you're not even with us? And God's like, my hands are tied. You guys are too stiff-necked. And he includes Moses in the stiff-necked people at this point. He says, I can't go with you. And Moses says, you got to go with us. Well, then you'll be destroyed. Okay, we got to come up with a compromise. Moses thinks, and he says, I know. How about this? Let me see your glory. I'll hide behind this rock, and you can walk by, and kind of this personification exercise. I don't know what happened. But somehow Moses' compromise was, let me see your glory, and then I can reflect it. Then I can go back into the people, and I'll put a veil on my face, because the veil, again, is an act of mercy, because if I don't put the veil on, they may just get burnt from the glory shining out of my face. So Moses says, how about that for a compromise? I'll see you face to face. You can still stay outside the camp. I'll watch you, and then I'll come into the camp, speak on your behalf, and when I'm done, I'll put the veil on before they all get singed, because they're stiff-necked people. God says, okay, that's a fair compromise. We'll do that. So then they can go into the promised land. God is still in their midst, shining on Moses' face, but with a veil. It's an act of mercy because they're not going to get obliterated, but it's also a very sad thing. Because it's only the presence of God that can transform a people. And that's the second problem with humanity. Is one, we're chronically stiff-necked, stubborn, self-centered, want to do it our way. Second thing is, even those moments where we're not stiff-necked and we want to do what's right, we don't have the power to do it. Because God's glory and His presence is veiled from us, so we don't have access. We're not like the moon that can look at the sun and then reflect it to the earth. We're like Pluto's little moon that has no access. I'm assuming it has no access. You're suggesting. Imagine some planet that is always hidden behind something else. It's always veiled from the sun, so it never sees the sun. It's always dark. That's what we're like. Because we're stiff-necked, we don't have the will to be good, and we lack the power to be good. Because God cannot dwell amongst stiff-necked people. So then Moses goes up the mountain again. God renews the covenant, gives them 10 commandments again, and that's what they do. Chapter 34, verse 34. 34. Got it? In a minute there. When Moses finished speaking to them, he put a veil over his face. He's kind of like a G.I. Joe guy with the big red mask. What's that guy's name? Cobra? It's like that. He's like always wearing something like that. This big red mask with eye holes in it. But whenever Moses entered the Lord's presence, which was outside the camp in a tent, because God couldn't be inside the stiff-necked group, he had to be outside. So Moses would go into there to meet with God, and he removed the veil whenever he spoke to God face to face, as friends do, and then he came out, he put the veil back on. All of that is background to 2 Corinthians chapter 3. So far what we've established is, how do we know that God is working through us? Well, let's take a step back. Is it even possible for God to work through us? The answer is no. Because we lack the will to let God work through us, and we lack the power to let God work through us. We've seen that pretty clearly in Exodus 32 to 34. If God's not in your presence, He can't transform you and change you so that you can reflect Him. And you don't really want it to happen anyways. So the will and the power. Now at this point, Paul is writing to the believers in Corinth, and he's going to describe to them how he, Paul, is the new Moses. Anyone ever had to deal with a government ministry before? All of us probably have. Okay. Let's use the ministry of children and families, for example. They're called a ministry. You work for that ministry, Sherman? Yeah. So technically you're called a minister. Because what Sherman does in his job is, someone comes to the government for help, and then Sherman acts as a minister. He leverages the power and the help and the assistance of the government for the person that's coming for help. That's what Moses does. He goes to God, sees him face to face, takes from God and gives it to the people. Paul says, I am the new Moses. He says that in verse 6, chapter 3, verse 6. And the reason why he's going to make this point is the believers in Corinth were seriously thinking about getting rid of Paul and not following him anymore. Kind of like in the first story, who is this fellow Paul? They were saying that about Paul. They're saying, we can do fine without you. Other guys have come in. They're telling us a version of Christianity that's a lot easier than your version. We're moving on. We've outgrown you, Paul. So he's making a case. You haven't outgrown me. Here's why you need me. And they're like, well, if you're so great, how come people aren't becoming Christians? How come the Jewish people aren't responding to your message? He says there's a reason why. It has to do with the stiff neck. So that's where he's going. He's defending himself and his ministry. So verse 6, chapter 3. God has made us, speaking of himself, competent, we're good at it, ministers of a new covenant. The first covenant was with 10 Commandments and the veil and all that. The new one is Jesus. So the new covenant is not of the letter, it's not those carved letters in the rocks, the 10 Commandments, but it's of the Spirit. For the letter kills. We can't keep those 10 Commandments. God's glory burns us. And because we can't keep it, we can't go into God's presence. It's this vicious circle. It kills. There's no life there. God's standards never changes. It's the ministry that changes. A lot of Christians get this mixed up, by the way. They'll say, oh, we don't keep the 10 Commandments anymore. That's faded away. It's not what's faded away. The ministry of Moses has faded away. Now there's a new ministry to help us live the 10 Commandments the way they were intended. So God's laws and rules have not faded away. Jesus makes this clear in Matthew 5-7. He says, you just got them all wrong, and here's the power to keep them. It's the ministry that's fading away. It's still glorious in that it's from God. But the new one, how much more glorious is the ministry that brings, end of verse 9, righteousness. This is so key. This is crucial. Because if you want to figure out, well, how do I get around this stiff neck of mine? Because I got it. Here's how. What if somebody took the death that you deserve for that stiff neck and gave you a righteous standing? So even though you're standing there with your stiff neck, God can look at you and say, stiff neck or not, someone already paid for that. You now have a righteous standing even though you don't deserve it. Obviously, that's what Jesus did for us. So Jesus deals with the first problem, which is the problem of the will. He says, your stiff neck no longer separates you from God. He's no longer going to burn you or obliterate you or kill you or destroy you because he destroyed Jesus on your behalf. Jesus took your stiff neck on the cross, paid for it. Now this new ministry gives you righteousness. And where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. There's freedom from futility. There's freedom from banging your head against the wall. There's freedom to not experiencing a spiritual life. There's freedom from all of that because the stiff neck, the problem of will, has been dealt with by Jesus. And the problem of power and transformation has also been dealt with. How glorious is that? How awesome is that? That we now have access to forgiveness for the stiff neck and power to change. Verse 18, and we all, who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, we can gaze on the Son, are being transformed into His image with ever-increasing glory. It's a process. Over time, the more time you spend looking at the glory of God, we'll get to that in a second, you will slowly be transformed. You'll be given the power